So I would like to invite to the stage David to bring us more to this topic, tell us why we should care about it, and yeah, share your learnings and your inspirations with us. Thank you.
Thank you, Carolina. And so how's everybody doing? Okay. I partly want to welcome you here to Cure. I don't know if you've had a chance to look around. I am a journalist and a writer, as Carolina said, but I also am the creative director here at Cure. So I hope you're having a fabulous experience. I mean, we're very proud of the building. It's pretty new. So really super happy to have you here. So I'm going to ask you again, how are you doing? Yeah? Oh my God, that was great. You've been sitting here all day and holding that in. Anyway, so I've been asked to be quick here because I know we're reaching the end of the day, and I've also been asked to kind of connect part of the day with digital health, let's say healthy longevity, yes, and this idea of green, the green science and sustainability. So I came up with this idea. Actually, I didn't come up with it. I'm working with some people that are talking about the idea of stewardship. So I do want to get radical here a little bit, if that's okay. Don't want to shock anyone. But the idea here with radical stewardship is that sustaining the earth sustains us. And I actually report on all of these areas that you guys have been talking about. At least over the years, I have covered all of these things. So I'm going to kind of rocket through here and try to tie it together. I want to cover some of the philosophical territory as well, some specifics. So here we go. Radical stewardship. And start with one of my favorite authors, Rachel Carson. In nature, nothing exists alone. Okay, we humans have been on quite a tear, at least some of us, trying to go it alone, like we can control everything. And I think we can agree after hearing today and what's going on in the world right now, especially this crazy summer with weather patterns and things, that we are not alone here. And if we think we can control nature, we're mistaken. So introduce this word. Stewardship has been around since the 14th century. It's actually an Old English word, or comes from an Old English word about, taking care of things. But I like the idea that it's a responsible and careful management of something that's important. So in this definition, Merriam-Webster, the sentence they gave, they used the word in stewardship of natural resources. Okay, I'm going to add this stewardship of human health. And it's being a little human-centric, but hey, we are humans and we want to take care of ourselves. So this is linking together these two ideas around the idea of good stewardship for the planet is good stewardship for us. So I'm going to cover these three areas very quickly here. And I'm going to also introduce hopefully some new ideas or some new facts anyway that you may not have heard about, especially with the new book that came out that I wrote about 2 weeks ago. And by the way, I should say I am a journalist. I write for the Vanity Fair, Atlantic, New York Times, a bunch of others, and I've covered healthcare and life sciences for about 25 years. I was an ABC News reporter in Washington. We were talking about this at lunch. I covered healthcare, the White House, and Congress. I got kind of tired of reporting on the same stories of how the system didn't work very well, so I pivoted to science. So more recently have been covering climate change, and especially in this book. So we all know the images of big, attractive, photogenic animals like polar bears, not to belittle that at all. But we know about what I call the macro challenges that are brought on by climate change. This is San Francisco. I was actually there. I now live in Boston, but I've lived in San Francisco most of the last 25 years. This was a day in 2020 when there was a marine layer over the city. It was like a force shield, fires to the north. The smoke came over the top of the marine layer, and it looked like Mars. And you could actually breathe. I mean, we didn't even smell the smoke very much down on the street. but this is the way it looked. So just giving you a little bit of what we all have read about. I could go on and on and on, but what I'd like to talk to you about in my little bit here on climate change is the micro world. So I have a new book out. My co-author is a gentleman named Craig Venter, who you probably have heard of. He was one of the people that sequenced the first human genome. He actually created the first synthetic organism in a lab, very famous scientist. He also spent 15 years in a sailboat. He's a sailor, he loves to sail. This sailboat is called Sorcerer II, and they scoured the world looking for microbes in the oceans and volcanic vents, coming off of glaciers in Alaska, all over the world. In fact, these are all the voyages they took between 2003 and 2018. And primarily they did an around the world trip that was about 2.5 years. But they collected vast amounts of microbes. And Craig has an institute in La Jolla, California, and they sent these samples back to be genetically sequenced. And so he created this DNA library, or he and his team. And by the way, it was a collaboration of hundreds of people around the world. It was quite extensive. And they really rewrote the rules of what we know about this tiny little universe. And just to give you a couple little glimpses into that, because most people don't even know about it, you sort of suspect it's there. We ourselves, humans, have 30 some odd trillion microbes in each of us. And that's a lot. But the world has its own microbiome. We're a tiny little ecosystem in the vast global ecosystem of microbes. And there are more microbes than stars in the universe, perhaps. That's the estimate anyway. So we have a lot of these little critters running around, and we have found them basically in every nook and cranny on the planet. And in the book, we call our planet, in fact, Planet Microbe, because they really run the planet, not us. This is another one where, we are not in charge. They really are. And they've been around for 3.5 billion years or so. We haven't been around quite that long, so there you go. There's also, out of this expedition came a vast amount of science, thousands and thousands of studies, including this PLOS collection that was published back in 2008 from the initial expedition. So if you want to check any of this out. So what we're doing with the microbiome of the planet is with climate change, we are affecting the microbiome of the planet. We are changing it, we are altering it. And this is a little scary because among the many important things that these microbes do, they produce things like oxygen in the atmosphere, or at least a lot of it, about 60% of it. And it's produced mostly by phytoplankton, which live on the surface of the ocean. They absorb sunlight and carbon and other nutrients that are swept up from the bottom of the ocean, and they produce oxygen. So one of the many things that's happening as we're kind of drenching the atmosphere with carbon is we are drowning the phytoplankton in carbon. They love carbon, but not quite as much as we are forcing them, kind of force feeding them. And we're beginning to see a die-off of larger phytoplankton. And this is pretty serious, and I didn't know about this. I am a journalist, not a scientist. And when I found out about that I was like, wow, do I really need another, horrible thing happening with climate change? But that's one of the things that's happening. We're also, with climate change affecting the temperatures of the ocean, we're affecting the currents that keep these little critters fed from sweeping up nutrients from the bottom of the ocean. Phytoplankton also sequester about 30% of the carbon in the atmosphere. So they're very important. It's called the carbon marine cycle, and it's under threat right now, and we write about that in the book. You also have microbes being affected by other chemicals, like phosphates and nitrogen from fertilizers that are being used in farms. They get in the rivers and they dump into the ocean. This is what's called a dead zone, and that is Louisiana. That's the Gulf Coast of the United States. And this dead zone, which it goes in and out of, depending on the season, what the size of it is, but it can be as large as the state of New Jersey. And a dead zone means that these chemicals support a particular type of microbe that basically suck up all the oxygen, and fish and other animals can't live in that zone. And these are the dead zones around the world. So it's a little scary, and they're growing in number and growing in size. We also know about plastics, and There's a whole microbial communities that are being created around these plastics. There's not that much known about them, but some of them are producing, excreting toxins that, are sort of brand new poisons into the ocean. Microbes also are responsible, at least in part, for why coral is bleaching and dying. Because I didn't know this, but they're microbes, they're little tiny algae that live in a symbiotic relationship with algae, and they keep them healthy. They're kind of the immune system, or part of the immune system for coral. They also give coral its beautiful colors. So when the temperature gets warm, other chemicals are introduced, these coral eject their little symbiotic friends, and then they die. So anyway, those are some of the things that we get into in the book. And I will get some positive, I'll give you some positive news towards the end here, but so I don't mean to be relentlessly pessimistic here about all of this. If you don't want to read the book, which I'd love you to read the book, but if you want to get a quick version of this, I wrote a piece in Vanity Fair about 2 weeks ago, which you can check out, and also in Scientific American, which is a little more of a scientific take on all of this. So, healthy longevity, part 2. This tree here is called Methuselah, and it's a pine tree in Southern California that's over 4,000 years old. And I, by the way, wrote a book on longevity, the science of longevity, and it's an interesting field because there are a lot of people that are obviously trying to push lifespan. We're talking here about the kind of the practical effects of growing older, but there are people that are trying to stop that and actually stop aging itself. And so they look at something like Methuselah and say, hey, if it happened with a pine tree, maybe it can happen with us. And you get covers like this, and I did not write this story, but in Time magazine, where the first child, to live to be 142 years old, I'm not sure why they picked 142, may have been born today. So when I deal with healthy longevity, I'm reporting on it, I'm often reporting on the people that are trying to really push out lifespan. And obviously I wrote a whole book on this, but there are a lot of issues around that. We're having a hard time dealing, as we heard today, with our current lifespan, and for a lot of people. So it's a little questionable whether we really want to push out to live to be 150 or 300 or 1,000 or something like that. Anyway, so to give you a little scope of human life expectancy, and I didn't see the whole program today, so I don't know if I'm repeating this, but this is what the UN has estimated life expectancy to be. And by the way, this does start at when people are born, and it's always pointed out to me when I show this chart that infant mortality isn't factored in, and especially when you go back in time, like to the early 20th century, infant mortality really affected this rate, and it affects it less now, although it's still a factor. But you see us topping out, in the 90s, in about 100 years from now, or 100 plus years. And what's interesting here too is how we doubled in lifespan from 1900 to almost the present now, and we will continue that trend. There is amazing technologies out there. As I said, this is an area I report on. There are a lot of people, there's sort of the, let's say, less credible part of the longevity technology industry, people that are kind of have wild theories and it may or may not work and probably won't. But there's a lot of work being done, consciously to understand the process of aging. And, can we treat aging as a disease as opposed to a condition? And there are some similarities with a lot of diseases. In fact, the biggest factor, risk factor for many diseases once you reach a certain age is aging. So there are a lot of people working on that. It's an area I work on. Part of this whole reporting I've done was a project that I called the Experimental Man Project. And this started back in 2001 when I was one of the first humans to be sequenced, genetically sequenced. And I was doing a story for Wired magazine, which I've got up there. And they asked me to do a story on the Human Genome Project. I had just pivoted from being a political reporter to a science reporter. And I was like, okay, I don't understand this. It's a bunch of 4 letters that were just repeated over and over again. And so I asked to actually be sequenced. And so I was able to write about that. And that got me going on being the kind of human guinea pig for the next 10 or 12 years for testing virtually every test that didn't hurt me in healthcare. and it includes some of the digital health stuff that was talked about earlier today. And at the moment, I'm somewhere around 70 terabytes of data that I've collected on myself. And obviously I have whole talks and books on this, but I can tell you that we aren't yet ready to understand most of that data. I would say 99% of that, all of that data has not been useful to me, although there have been a few things. So I'm not going to get into that in great detail, but this is kind of one way to look at this idea of staying healthy and healthy longevity and where we are as a society. One thing I will share with you, though, it gets back to this idea of how the environment affects our health, and something you may or may not be aware of. I'm sure you're somewhat aware of it. But one of the tests I did for this project for National Geographic, they asked me to go out and get tested for hundreds of environmental chemicals. And this was a huge project we did. They spent, the magazine spent thousands of dollars. I was tested for pesticides, phthalates, heavy metals, pretty much everything that I could get a test for. And this was my chemical report card that's in the National Geographic story. And I got tested for things like DDT, or actually the metabolite it breaks down into, which stays in your body, called DDE, PCBs, flame retardants. And these are the percentages that I was higher than the average in the United States. And you can see flame retardants, 1,200%. Now, that all sounds a little scary. We all have these chemicals in us, but these are parts per billion, parts per trillion. They're probably so low that they don't really affect us. And then getting back, kind of circling back here a little bit to our friends, these phytoplankton, and the idea of these chemicals being in the atmosphere and how they get there. And again, carbon isn't the only thing to worry about. And that doesn't primarily affect climate change, but in terms of human health, we have things like mercury. And mercury is mostly in the earth until we burn it as coal. That's the primary source that actually gets out into the environment. I'm not picking on China here, but this could be the United States or Europe. You can actually see from space these clouds of effluents coming from coal burning power plants, in this case in China. And not only do they contain carbon, they also contain mercury, which it blows over the Pacific Ocean, it falls into the sea. The phytoplankton, it gets absorbed by the phytoplankton, because it's all microscopic. It's then eaten by small fish, larger fish eat them. It goes on up the food chain until you get to the big predator fish. And as part of my experimental man project, this is actually a swordfish that I ate for dinner way back in 2008 or so. And I also had a halibut for lunch on the same day. So what I did was I tested myself for mercury just before, my mercury level blood test, and right after. So before was 4 parts per billion, after was 13 parts per billion. And at the time, the safety threshold, according to the EPA, was about 6 parts per billion. So this is from 2 meals of fish. So this is a case where human activity is affecting human health in ways that, we're kind of aware of, but maybe not as much as we should be. I even took it another step, which was trying to do a sort of genetic test to see how susceptible I might be to mercury exposure, because every environmental input that we have a spectrum of responses, which is partly regulated by our DNA. Some people are very sensitive to mercury, some people are very affected by, or some people are very protected by it. And so that has to do with genetics. And again, check out, here's the book, When I'm 164, which was the aging book, and this is also an experimental man book. But anyway, just to give you a little glimpse, I also, of course, have to add in the United States, our life expectancy starting a couple years ago, about 3 years ago, started going down. And this is, addiction. It initially was the pandemic, of obesity, some other reasons that had happened, while in other industrialized countries, it's continued. It dipped in the pandemic, but it's back up again. And that's not probably directly attributable to, say, something like climate change, but it is happening, partly because of human activity. So I'm going to round it out here with sustainability, introduce another word, equilibrium. And this is both kind of a philosophical word, maintaining your equilibrium, but it's also about maintaining the natural equilibrium and the human equilibrium. And this term was introduced to me by microbiologists about the fact that the microbiome of the planet keeps our ecosystem in an equilibrium that supports us. I mean, if it went, say, if our oxygen went down in the atmosphere, or the equilibrium would shift. And so this is something that we want to maintain, and this is where kind of, you know, sustainability comes in. So where are we with this? I mean, why is this not happening? Why are we not more worried? Or why are we not taking our worry and our anxiety and actually taking stronger action? And we are. I mean, I think the world is slowly coming around. You know, we have the UN reports and goals. We aren't really hitting most of them at the moment. So why aren't we acting more quickly and with more urgency on this? And I wanted to ask you all, because you've been sitting there quietly all day, to just with a raise of hands, is it technology? And let me run through the 4 possible answers here, and then I'll ask you to raise your hand. So technology, investment, policy, or human behavior? What is the roadblock towards this? So how many people think it's technology? Interesting. I mean, don't forget, I come to Silicon Valley, everybody would have raised their hands. Investment or money? Okay, and you know what, you can raise your hand more than once, okay? Policy, politics? Okay, not surprising given the sort of UN global audience here. Human behavior. Okay, so obviously the last 2 are related. And I, as a tech reporter, as a science reporter, but a former political reporter, can tell you that we have the technologies, we know how to fix this. It really is a policy problem, and it's a human willpower issue. So just to leave you with a couple thoughts, radical stewardship, enlightened self-interest, you know, it will help us as humans. We need everyone to engage. We need to reframe the idea of growth and learn from past mistakes. This is an interesting one, which I'm actually writing about right now. We humans have actually evolved to be able to learn from mistakes. I mean, we don't know that other animals are able to do that or not, you know, but we can look at what we've done, and we can actually try to predict our future and change our behaviors. The question is, will we actually do it in this case? We need every decision to be based on maintaining equilibrium. And I do want to remain optimistic, and I don't have any time here to get more into the optimistic, but I think you know what I'm talking about. I mean, we have done this before in the United States and Europe and other places. We created an Environmental Protection Agency, Clean Water Act, Clean Air Act back in the 70s during a Republican administration, and it actually did reverse a lot of the really awful pollution that was going on around that time. I also wanted to put up my family, because this is really about us. When we're talking about humans and making all of this work. Leave you with another Rachel Carson quote: "The fabric of life is on the one hand delicate and destructible, on the other miraculously tough and resilient, and capable of striking back in unexpected ways." So thank you very much.